Pre-order my book, American Evil, in the description below. I've been seeing this all over the internet. I've been seeing people point this out. Xbox and PlayStation are clearly on the way out, right? Xbox in particular has botched all of their goodwill with Xbox Game Pass and all of those studio acquisitions. Nobody's going to work with them again. Nobody trusts them. Nobody wants to support them again. It's over. And when they go, PlayStation goes. They will not be able to maintain their control over the industry with a single gaming platform, right? The third parties are going to have to support Nintendo hardware more going forward. And once that happens, it's going to be more and more difficult to continue the illusion that Nintendo is preventing people from developing mature games on their platform, right? Once Nintendo starts getting the third party games that PC and PlayStation are getting, it's over. Okay. And that's been happening for a long time. This isn't anything new. This has been something that Nintendo has been working on since the Wii U era. But it seems like the fruit has come to, the fruit is ripe, essentially, for Nintendo to dominate the console industry. And the competition will never, ever be able to compete with them again, right? That's essentially what we're seeing now. And what this means is that Harman Smith, the Nintendo fanboy YouTuber who's been talking about this kind of thing for over a decade, right? Since what? Like 2012, right? Harman Smith was right about everything. I was saying that Nintendo was going to dominate the industry by the Wii U era. Back then that was very apparent to me because I noticed playing all these major PlayStation 3 exclusives just how lower quality they were compared to Nintendo ones, right? Just how they didn't innovate, just how they didn't do anything new or exciting or fresh. It was just the same tired thing over and over and over and over again, right? Buying a PS3 in a way was the gaming decision that made me realize just how much better Nintendo actually is, right? like playing all these big PS3 exclusives made me realize that wow, I had it good, growing up with Pokemon and Fire Emblem and Batten Kaitos Origins and Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, The Legend of Zelda. It was weird, right? The narrative growing up, listening to these gaming magazines was that ooh, Nintendo is going out of business. They won't be able to stay competitive. They won't be able to compete. The brand is going under. But the reality is, if you actually look at how they conduct their business, it was really obvious to me that Nintendo was successful. It was very obvious to me that nothing Nintendo was doing was wrong at all. A very commonly held narrative that people have is that oh, the N64 only sold 33 million units. That was a failure. Not true. They made money on the N64, right? They had the Game Boy, right, which was a hugely successful platform at the time, right? The narrative that the N64 was a failure is not true. Nintendo had some of the most successful games of that generation on that platform. So to try and try to write that thing off as a failure, trying to say the controller was weird or that nobody cared for the games on it or that there were droughts. That's the thing I saw people trying to do even today was trying to say that the N64 didn't have a lot of games. When you actually take all that into consideration. When you think about it, when you research it, when you go through everything the N64 was, when you look back on it and see how many people still play and enjoy that console even today, right? You realize that those people were absolutely completely out of touch with reality. Right? The reality was the N64 was a masterpiece of a console, was hugely successful and influential, right? Having some of the best games ever made. Star Fox 64, Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, cult classics like Sin and Punishment Star Successor and Ogre Battle 64, Harvest Moon 64. The N64 was just loaded with great games. And yet people just had this idea that the company behind it was doomed for failure, right? We saw the same thing with the GameCube. We saw the same thing with the Wii, even when it was dominating the sales charts, right? Everybody had this narrative that the bubble would eventually pop and Nintendo would go out of business. But that has clearly not been the case. Like at any point, like Nintendo was never at any risk of bankruptcy, never. And yet you always saw these people like pretend that Nintendo was mismanaging all their brands and their hardware and stuff like that. Like how often have you heard over the past several years that Nintendo hardware is underpowered, right? The reality is, Nintendo hardware is more reasonably priced, right? It's more affordable for the company. They have higher profit margins on the hardware and the software that they develop for it. So what that means is that they make more money per unit sold. Like they don't have to spend as much money to make money as Sony and Microsoft do. And what's happened is that like Sony and Microsoft, the way they handle things, losing money with each unit sold, like having to spend like a decade producing new video games, right? Like it took like what, 12 years to produce Starfield only for that to come out, like only for that to fail when it came out. Like that's insane. That is insane to think about. Like Skyrim, like if you follow up on something like Skyrim, like you should have something that people are actually enthusiastic about, something that people actually want to play. But by the time Starfield came out, like Bethesda completely lost all their credibility because they hadn't been doing anything relevant, anything good since Skyrim came out. Ever since that game came out, they've been coasting on its success. You can cry all you want, like, oh, Skyrim sold 60 million copies, but like, in between the newer Zelda games, not only has Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild almost done that much, like in between them, like we got a sequel. We got like new interesting mechanics. We got a better game in general. And not only that, we have options. We have more options to choose from than the open world fantasy RPG, right? We actually have stuff like Mario, stuff like Fire Emblem, stuff like Animal Crossing, stuff like Endless Ocean, right? Stuff like, remakes of classics like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door and Luigi's Mansion 2 and another Code R, right? Like we have a lot of games that are coming out right now really that are going to be very, very successful. And we're at the point now where I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the industry to downplay these games the way they used to. Like we saw this with Princess Peach Showtime, where everybody cried about that game and tried to pretend it wasn't very good and that it was too easy or yada yada yada. And yet, like we see like the results of like the sales numbers that it sold like 1 million in like 10 days or something, and we can see that it's a roaring success in spite of the industry's attempts at undermining it. And that success is only going to grow as the years go on. By the time like this game gets a sequel, which I'm sure it will, like the first one is going to be seen as an all-time classic, like way more so than Super Princess Peach, which I always saw as like a lazy, like gender flipped version of Super Mario Bros. Like, Princess Peach Showtime actually has its own identity, it has its own personality, it has its own design, like it has its own unique mechanics, and like I think a lot of people really appreciate it for that reason, right? And the industry tried to be up to their own tricks. They tried to create a narrative about that game. They tried downplaying it. They tried like pretending this was some disappointing thing. But the reality of the situation is that the game was fantastic, and there's nothing they can really do to mitigate that. Like you can cry about how like, oh, there's nothing to play on Switch, but Unicorn Overlord came out earlier that month. Like, were you talking about that? Were you talking about all the other great eShop games that came out around that period? No. Like again, I think people are becoming more and more aware of what's actually happening when it comes to like the people who criticize Nintendo. The pretendos I call them, is that these are people who are going to be unhappy with Nintendo regardless of what they do, right? That is the reality of the situation, is that they're always going to complain no matter what Nintendo puts out and what they release, right? Like it's always going to be complaints from them, it's always going to be complaining, and more and more I think people are starting to see through it. Like in a way I think the Harman Smith arc has kind of reached its natural conclusion, because like I was right about everything that I was saying about Nintendo over the past several years. And I do expect this is going to be like this is going to lead into a new glorious age for the company. There is not going to be any ill will towards Nintendo coming from the gaming community going forward.